September 15, 1944. The first waves of U.S. Marines hit the beaches of Peleliu, expecting a quick seizure of a small island barely 7 miles long. Intelligence officers had estimated the fight would last 3 or 4 days. Instead, it would become one of the most punishing battles of the Pacific War, stretching more than 2 months and costing thousands of casualties. The reason was not the beaches, it was the ridges. Peleliu was part of the Palau Island chain, positioned along General Douglas MacArthur's planned route back to the Philippines. American planners believed capturing its airfield would protect the flank of future operations. But what they did not fully grasp was how completely the Japanese had transformed the island's northern coral highlands into a defensive labyrinth. By mid-1944, Japanese strategy in the Pacific had changed. Early war banzai charges had produced dramatic resistance but catastrophic losses. On Peleliu, Colonel Kunio Nakagawa commanded roughly 10,000 troops and adopted a new doctrine: defense in depth. Instead of charging into machine gun fire, his men burrowed into the island itself. They carved hundreds of caves, tunnels, and firing positions into the Umurbrogol Ridge complex, later nicknamed Bloody Nose Ridge by the Marines. These weren't simple foxholes. They were reinforced chambers with steel doors, concealed apertures, and interlocking fields of fire. Many positions were protected from naval bombardment by solid coral overhead. Some were connected by tunnels that allowed defenders to disappear after firing and re-emerge somewhere else entirely. When American battleships shelled Peleliu before the landing, observers believed the bombardment had shattered the defenses. It had not. The coral absorbed punishment that would have flattened softer terrain. Japanese artillery pieces were rolled out from cave mouths, fired, and pulled back behind steel shutters. Mortars were pre-sighted on likely landing zones. Machine gun nests were positioned so that any advance inland would be raked from multiple angles at once. The heat was another enemy. Temperatures soared above 110 degrees Fahrenheit. There was almost no natural fresh water. Marines carried limited canteens, and resupply under fire was inconsistent. Heat exhaustion and dehydration became as dangerous as bullets. The coral ground shredded boots and knees. Dust mixed with sweat and blood into a choking paste. Once the Marines moved off the beaches and toward the airfield, the illusion of progress faded. The real fight began when units pushed north toward the ridges. There, every fold in the terrain concealed another firing slit. A single bunker could dominate an entire approach, and destroying it was rarely simple. Standard infantry doctrine relied on suppressing fire, flanking movement, and close assault with grenades or flamethrowers. But on Peleliu, flanking often meant exposing oneself to a second, unseen position. Grenades bounced off hardened coral or failed to penetrate narrow embrasures. Even direct hits from artillery sometimes left cave positions intact. Japanese defenders were ordered to hold positions as long as possible, then withdraw through tunnels to secondary lines. Night infiltration became common. Marines who thought they had cleared a ridge would wake to rifle fire from behind them. The battlefield had no clear front line. It was vertical, layered, and alive beneath the surface. By the third day, casualty lists mounted rapidly. Entire squads were pinned down by single, well-concealed machine guns. Tanks sent forward to support infantry struggled in the broken coral terrain. Communication lines were cut. The battle devolved into small unit actions, where corporals and sergeants made life-or-death decisions without immediate officer oversight. The Umurbrogol pocket became the center of resistance. Rising, jagged, and pale against the tropical sky, its ridges formed natural amphitheaters of death. From these heights, Japanese gunners observed and targeted every movement below.
Marines described advancing a few yards at a time, diving for cover, then advancing again under blistering fire. The smell of cordite and burned coral hung constantly in the air. It was in this environment that improvisation became as valuable as ammunition. Flamethrowers proved effective against caves, but required operators to approach within dangerous range. Satchel charges could collapse entrances, but demanded exposure to accurate rifle fire. When flamethrower teams were killed or pinned down, infantry units were left with rifles, machine guns, and whatever nerve they could muster. By late September, it was clear that Peleliu would not be a 3-day operation. It would be a grinding, attritional fight against an enemy who had reshaped geology into a fortress. Every ridge concealed another bunker. Every bunker covered another approach. Every advance required someone willing to crawl forward into fire. In that kind of battle, survival often depended not just on orders from generals, but on decisions made in seconds by men hugging the ground behind shattered coral. The official manuals described proper procedures for assaulting fortified positions, but manuals were written in classrooms. Peleliu was written in heat, dust, and blood. Somewhere along those ridges, pinned between hardened coral and concealed guns, Marines would face a problem that standard weapons could not solve. And when conventional answers failed, the line between regulation and desperation began to blur.
By the time the Marines pushed into the broken spine of the Umurbrogol Ridges, the battle had stopped looking like a coordinated offensive and started to resemble a series of isolated duels. Fire came from everywhere and nowhere at once. A squad might move 20 yards forward, only to discover they were trapped in a bowl of coral with at least 2 hidden firing positions overlapping their approach. The geometry of Peleliu favored the defender. Every ridge crest masked another slope. Every shadow could hide a muzzle flash. In many sectors, the most dangerous combination was not just infantry in caves, but the coordination between fixed bunkers and mobile armor. Although the Japanese had relatively few tanks on Peleliu, they deployed Type 95 Hago light tanks in ways designed to exploit terrain and confusion. The Hago was not heavily armored by American standards. Its frontal armor measured roughly 12 millimeters, but against small arms fire, it was more than sufficient. Rifle rounds flattened, standard buckshot scattered harmlessly. Even 30 caliber machine gun fire struggled to penetrate, except at extremely close range and favorable angles. The Hago mounted a 37 millimeter main gun and 2 machine guns, more than enough to devastate exposed infantry. In open terrain, American Shermans could outmatch it decisively, but the ridges of Peleliu were not open terrain. Jagged coral outcroppings limited maneuverability. Sightlines were short and unpredictable. A light tank appearing at the edge of a ridgeline could fire into pinned infantry before heavier American armor could be brought forward to respond. Imagine a squad hugging the reverse slope of a coral rise. To their front, perhaps 50 yards away, a bunker slit flashes repeatedly with sustained machine gun fire. The aperture is narrow, cut into reinforced coral and shielded by sandbags and rock. Grenades thrown uphill fail to reach it. Rifle grenades require exposure to line up the shot. Every attempt to shift position draws immediate fire from a second unseen point. The bunker is not alone. It is part of a system. Now, add the sound of steel tracks grinding against coral, the distinct clatter of a tank engine rising over rifle fire. The Hago does not need to charge recklessly. It advances deliberately, using the bunker's suppressive fire as cover. The bunker keeps heads down. The tank closes distance. Infantry pinned in such a position face a narrowing window of survival. Standard-issue weapons offer limited answers. The M1 Garand is accurate and powerful, but not designed to defeat armored vehicles. The Browning automatic rifle provides suppressive fire, yet cannot crack hardened coral or steel plate. The 12-gauge trench gun, such as the Winchester Model 12 used by many Marines, is devastating in close quarters against exposed troops. At short range, buckshot spreads into a lethal pattern, but against a reinforced firing slit, pellets behave like thrown gravel. Against tank armor, they are meaningless. The primary infantry solution to bunkers in the Pacific theater was the flamethrower. Its psychological and physical impact was immense. Burning fuel forced defenders from caves or suffocated them within. But flamethrower operators were prime targets. The weapon was heavy, with limited fuel, and required approach within dangerously close range. If the flamethrower team was killed, wounded, or simply positioned on another ridge, a squad could find itself without its most effective bunker-clearing tool. Coordination under such conditions was fragile. Radios malfunctioned or were damaged. Runners risked being shot before delivering messages. Supporting tanks could not always climb the sharp coral inclines without exposing their underbellies or stalling in rubble. Air support was rarely precise enough to target a single bunker slit embedded in rock. The Japanese defenders understood this. Their doctrine emphasized patience and discipline. Rather than waste ammunition, they waited for clear targets. They allowed Marines to advance into carefully planned engagement areas. When a squad committed to an approach, crossfire activated. A single bunker would not reveal itself until another position had already fixed the attackers in place. This created a tactical trap. The squad could not advance because of the bunker. They could not retreat because the tank was closing. Remaining stationary meant eventual destruction. The Hago's 37mm gun, though modest compared to larger tanks, could fire high explosive shells capable of shredding coral cover and sending lethal fragments into shallow depressions. Even near misses sprayed jagged shards like shrapnel. Under these circumstances, decisions devolved to the lowest level. A corporal might be the senior surviving leader in a 30-yard pocket of ground. He would have seconds to evaluate terrain, ammunition, enemy positioning, and the morale of his men. Waiting for reinforcements meant annihilation. Charging blindly would likely end the same way. Historical after-action reports from Peleliu repeatedly describe Marines improvising solutions, using demolition charges in unconventional ways, combining suppressive fire with sudden rushes, exploiting momentary lulls in Japanese fire discipline. The battle forced adaptation at the squad level because higher-level coordination often could not penetrate the chaos of the ridges. Pinned between a fortified bunker delivering precise, sustained fire and a light tank advancing with methodical intent, a squad faced more than a tactical problem. They faced a physics problem. Hardened coral absorbed small arms impact. Steel armor deflected pellets. Angles were too tight for conventional explosives. The available tools did not match the immediate threat. And in war, when tools fail and time collapses to seconds, survival often depends on someone willing to attempt something untested, not out of recklessness, because every standard option has already been exhausted. On Peleliu's ridges, that moment came more than once. The battlefield did not reward hesitation. It rewarded whatever worked. Improvisation in war is rarely born from creativity alone. It is born from failure. Failure of supply, failure of coordination, failure of weapons to perform as expected against conditions no training manual fully anticipated. On Peleliu, by late September 1944, Marines had already learned that coral was as much an enemy as the soldiers defending it. Standard explosives sometimes cracked bunker entrances, but failed to neutralize chambers buried deep within the rock. Small arms fire suppressed, but did not destroy. And when a squad found itself cut off from flamethrower support, the gap between doctrine and survival became painfully clear. The Winchester Model 12 trench gun was never designed to defeat armor or reinforced fortifications. It was a pump-action shotgun, widely respected for reliability and close-range stopping power. In earlier Pacific battles and even during World War I, shotguns had proven devastating in jungle or trench fighting. Loaded with buckshot, a 12-gauge shell could unleash multiple 33 caliber pellets in a tight spread at short distance. Against exposed infantry, the effect was brutal and immediate. But physics does not bend to desperation. Buckshot loses velocity quickly and spreads. Against hardened coral, pellets flatten or fragment without penetrating. Against steel plate, even the relatively thin armor of a Type 95 Ha-Go Buckshot is almost entirely ineffective unless striking an open hatch or vulnerable point at extremely close range. In a situation where a bunker slit measured only inches across and a tank was advancing methodically, the trench gun became, in practical terms, intimidation without penetration. That is where the idea of incendiary improvisation emerges, not as fantasy, but as a pattern repeated throughout warfare. Soldiers have long modified ammunition in the field. During World War II, both Allied and Axis forces used officially manufactured incendiary rounds for aircraft and machine guns. White phosphorus munitions were issued for smoke screens, and in some cases anti-personnel or bunker clearing purposes. Magnesium-based incendiaries were used in bombs and flares because of their intense heat and ability to continue burning even in oxygen-poor environments. White phosphorus ignites upon contact with oxygen and burns at temperatures exceeding 1500 degrees Fahrenheit. Magnesium burns even hotter, reaching approximately 3000 degrees Fahrenheit, producing a blinding white flame capable of igniting fuel, fabric, or exposed skin. These substances were not theoretical curiosities, they were standard components in military arsenals. However, integrating them safely into small arms shotgun shells was not something described in any issued field manual. A standard 12-gauge shell of the era consisted of a brass base, a paper hull, a primer, powder charge, wadding, and the shot column. Altering that internal balance changed pressure dynamics dramatically. Too much obstruction in the barrel could cause catastrophic failure, and uneven load might rupture the hull. The shotgun barrel, never designed to channel sustained incendiary spray, could theoretically turn into a conduit for backflash if ignition occurred prematurely. Yet, soldiers under extreme stress often experiment with what is available. Historical records from multiple theaters document improvised munitions, grenades enhanced with additional explosives, makeshift flamethrowers assembled from fuel and compressed gas, even modified rifle rounds intended to spark fires. These were not common practice nor officially sanctioned, but they reveal a pattern. When conventional solutions fail, chemistry becomes a weapon of opportunity. In a Coral Ridge fight, an incendiary discharge offered something buckshot could not: thermal effect. A burst of burning particles entering a confined bunker slit could ignite ammunition, fuel, or internal wooden supports. Even if structural destruction was limited, the psychological shock of intense flame penetrating a supposedly secure position could force defenders to withdraw or expose themselves. Against a tank, while armor plate would resist direct penetration, vulnerable points existed. Open hatches for ventilation or observation were necessary in tropical heat. Engine grills allowed airflow. Vision slits, though narrow, could admit sparks or burning fragments under the right angle. The concept, sometimes referred to as dragon's breath in modern times, is a commercially produced novelty shotgun round that expels a stream of burning magnesium sparks, visually dramatic but limited in tactical use. In 1944, no such standardized round existed for infantry shotguns. Any attempt to replicate similar effects would have required manually replacing buckshot with incendiary material and trusting that ignition would occur upon discharge rather than inside the chamber. The risk cannot be overstated. Shotgun pressures can exceed 10,000 psi. If improvised material obstructed the wad or altered combustion unpredictably, the result could be a burst barrel or severe injury to the shooter. Moreover, white phosphorus is notoriously unstable when exposed. Mishandling could cause accidental ignition before the shell was even chambered. There were no safety tests, no controlled range trials, only the immediate pressure of enemy fire and the narrowing margin between life and death.
But war repeatedly demonstrates that under certain conditions, individuals accept extraordinary technical risk to counter immediate tactical threat. The calculation becomes brutally simple: the probability of weapon failure versus the certainty of being overrun. In that equation, even a dangerous experiment can appear rational. On Peleliu's ridges, where bunkers were shielded by coral thick enough to resist naval bombardment, and tanks exploited every fold in the terrain, fire had a unique power: not just destructive heat, but disruption. Smoke forced repositioning, flame denied confined spaces. Even temporary ignition could shift momentum long enough for a squad to maneuver or escape. Improvised incendiary ammunition, if attempted, would not have been about spectacle. It would have been about altering the physical properties of the engagement, transforming a short-range scatter weapon into a device capable of projecting intense heat into openings measured in inches, betting that combustion would succeed where impact had failed. The line between ingenuity and recklessness is often visible only in hindsight. In the moment, pinned under overlapping fields of fire, that line disappears. What remains is a weapon in hand, materials scavenged from the battlefield, and the knowledge that standard ammunition is no longer enough.
In combat, there is always a moment when preparation ends and consequence begins. On Peleliu's ridges, that moment often arrived without warning. A lull in machine gun fire, the grinding shift of tank tracks repositioning, a brief silence that meant the defenders were adjusting, not retreating. In those seconds, decisions hardened into action. A bunker slit is a small target, but it represents a much larger threat. Behind it may sit a machine gun crew with overlapping arcs carefully mapped out before the battle even began. Japanese defensive engineering on Peleliu emphasized protection from frontal assault. Many bunker apertures were angled to reduce direct penetration. Some were shielded by protruding coral or sandbags to deflect incoming rounds. Firing positions were often recessed, meaning even a near hit would not necessarily disable the weapon inside. Conventional suppression could keep heads down temporarily, but it rarely neutralized the position. To end the threat, something had to enter that slit, something capable of forcing the crew out or incapacitating them within the confined space. In close-quarter Pacific warfare, flamethrowers were the most reliable solution. Their stream of burning fuel could cling to surfaces, roll through openings, and consume oxygen inside enclosed chambers. But without a flamethrower team present, infantry had to rely on what they carried. When an incendiary discharge leaves a shotgun barrel, it behaves very differently from buckshot. Instead of a cluster of lead pellets spreading outward, burning particles project forward in a narrow, intensely bright stream. Magnesium fragments ignite in flight, producing a white flare visible even in daylight. If combined with phosphorus, ignition can intensify upon exposure to air. The effect is brief, seconds rather than sustained flame, but within a confined space, seconds can be decisive. The key variable is angle. A bunker slit positioned slightly above ground level forces the shooter to expose himself to line up the shot. Too low, and the particles strike the coral lip beneath the opening. Too high, and they scatter across the reinforced face. Only a precise alignment allows burning fragments to pass through the aperture. Under active return fire, achieving that alignment requires extraordinary composure. Now add the tank. The Type 95 Ha-Go, though lightly armored, was not blind. It carried a 37mm gun capable of firing high explosive shells and armor-piercing rounds. Its crew had periscopes and vision slits, and in tropical heat, hatches were sometimes left partially open for ventilation. The engine compartment at the rear required airflow, protected by grills rather than solid plate. None of these were wide-open vulnerabilities, but they represented potential points where heat or sparks could cause disruption. A light tank advancing over coral ridges moves with caution. The terrain risks throwing tracks or exposing the undercarriage. Infantry support typically accompanies it, but in broken ridge fighting, separation can occur. If the tank edges forward to deliver a shot into a pinned position, it may temporarily operate with limited infantry screening. The psychological effect of flame in that environment cannot be overstated. Pacific combat veterans frequently described fire as one of the most terrifying battlefield elements. Coral ridges amplified sound. Echoes exploded. The sudden burst of white-hot sparks, streaking across open ground, would not resemble standard small arms fire. It would be visually shocking, even disorienting. For bunker defenders peering through a slit, the arrival of burning metal could force immediate withdrawal from the aperture. Inside a confined coral chamber, burning magnesium fragments striking sandbags, wooden braces, ammunition crates, or even fabric could ignite secondary fires. Even if structural collapse did not occur, smoke accumulation in a poorly ventilated bunker could render the firing position temporarily unusable. A machine gun crew forced to retreat from its primary embrasure breaks the interlocking pattern that pinned the attacking squad. Against a tank, the calculus is narrower but still present. If incendiary particles enter an open hatch, the interior environment changes instantly. Tanks contain fuel vapors, lubricants, and stored ammunition. While armor plate protects against penetration, it does not eliminate internal flammability. Even sparks landing near exposed equipment or crew could cause panic. A startled crew might close hatches abruptly, sacrificing visibility. A commander might withdraw to reassess rather than continue advancing blindly into unknown incendiary threat. It is important to ground this in physical reality. A single improvised incendiary shotgun blast would not reliably melt armor or detonate a tank from the outside. Hollywood exaggerates such effects, but disruption does not require catastrophic destruction. In small unit combat, even a 5-second interruption in coordinated enemy action can allow movement, shifting position, throwing a grenade, repositioning a machine gun, or retreating to safer ground. Marine after-action accounts from Peleliu frequently emphasize momentum. Units that stalled under crossfire suffered mounting casualties. Units that broke the rhythm of enemy fire, even briefly, could exploit that window. Fire, smoke, and shock were tools for breaking rhythm. Imagine the sequence: suppressive fire from surviving squad members. A narrow opening appears as bunker gunners adjust. A shot erupts, not the dull scatter of buckshot, but a brilliant white stream. Sparks vanish into the slit. Machine gun fire falters. Simultaneously, the tank commander, seeing unexpected flames streaking toward his vehicle, reacts, buttoning up, halting, or reversing slightly to assess the threat. In that compressed span of seconds, the geometry of death shifts. Whether such an improvised measure would consistently succeed is uncertain. War rarely offers guarantees, but on Peleliu, survival often hinged on creating asymmetry where none existed. The battlefield favored the defender until something unpredictable disrupted that balance. Fire is unpredictable. That unpredictability can terrify both target and user. Once ignited, it follows chemistry, not intention. For the man pulling the trigger, there is no second attempt at adjustment mid-flight. The effect is immediate, irreversible. And in the coral crucible of Peleliu, immediate and irreversible were often the only options left. When the shooting stopped on Peleliu in late November 1944, the island looked less like a battlefield and more like a quarry blasted apart by industrial force. The ridges were cratered, blackened, and littered with shattered coral. Of the roughly 10,000 Japanese defenders under Colonel Kunio Nakagawa, the vast majority were dead. Fewer than a few hundred were captured alive.
On the American side, the 1st Marine Division suffered over 6,500 casualties, including more than 1,200 killed. What had been projected as a brief operation became one of the bloodiest engagements per square mile in the Pacific War. In the aftermath of such battles, stories circulate. Stories of desperate measures, of improvised weapons, of actions that blurred the line between regulation and survival. That raises a larger question. What were the actual rules governing weapons like incendiaries during World War II, and would something resembling an improvised dragon's breath round have violated them? The Geneva Convention, most commonly referenced in popular discussion, is the 1929 Convention relative to the treatment of prisoners of war. It did not specifically prohibit the use of incendiary ammunition. Earlier agreements, such as the Hague Conventions of 1899 and 1907, addressed certain types of expanding bullets and prohibited projectiles designed to cause unnecessary suffering, particularly in the context of international warfare between signatory powers. However, enforcement and interpretation varied, and many of the most destructive weapons used in World War II, napalm, white phosphorus shells, incendiary bombs, were not categorically banned at the time. Incendiary weapons were widely employed by all major combatants. The United States used white phosphorus artillery rounds for smoke and anti-personnel effects. Incendiary bombs composed of magnesium and other compounds devastated cities in Europe and Japan. Flamethrowers were standard-issue equipment in the Pacific Theater, explicitly intended for bunker and cave clearing. The brutal nature of island warfare, where defenders fought from fortified underground positions, made fire one of the few reliably effective tools. That does not mean every possible application was endorsed or standardized. Militaries issue equipment that has been tested, manufactured under controlled conditions, and integrated into doctrine. An improvised modification to ammunition, especially one involving volatile materials, would not have been officially sanctioned. The risk to the user and nearby troops would have been substantial. Commanders generally discourage unsanctioned experimentation, not because innovation is unwelcome, but because unpredictable outcomes can endanger friendly forces as easily as the enemy. Yet war repeatedly forces individuals into gray zones. On Peleliu, as on Tarawa, Saipan, and Okinawa, small units often operated beyond immediate oversight. Communications broke down, officers were killed or wounded. Corporals and sergeants made decisions that would never appear in formal manuals. In that environment, survival sometimes outweighed procedural orthodoxy. There is also a psychological dimension. Fire has a uniquely primal impact. Veterans from the Pacific frequently describe the terror induced by flamethrowers, not only among those targeted, but among those deploying them. The weapon's effectiveness lay as much in fear as in flame. A sudden burst of intense heat penetrating a fortified space disrupted more than physical defenses. It disrupted morale and cohesion. From a strategic standpoint, the Battle of Peleliu remains controversial. Some historians argue the island's capture was unnecessary, that its airfield ultimately provided limited strategic value compared to the cost in lives. Others contend it secured MacArthur's flank and prevented potential Japanese interference with operations in the Philippines. What is uncontested is the human toll and the extreme conditions under which Marines fought. Within those conditions, the narrative of a corporal facing a bunker and a light tank encapsulates a broader truth about the Pacific War. Technology and doctrine set the framework, but individual initiative often determined immediate outcomes. The Marine Corps emphasized aggression, adaptability, and small unit leadership precisely because island warfare fragmented larger plans into isolated fights. If an improvised incendiary round was ever attempted in such a context, it would represent that fragmentation, a moment where official supply chains and written doctrine could not solve the immediate tactical equation. It would not symbolize disregard for law so much as the compression of time and choice that defines close combat. After Peleliu, the 1st Marine Division was pulled off the line and sent to rest on Pavuvu. Many Marines believed they would next land on Japan itself. Instead, they would fight again on Okinawa in 1945, facing even more elaborate cave systems and fortified ridges. Lessons from Peleliu about defense in depth, about the limits of pre-landing bombardment, about the necessity of coordinated armor and infantry shaped subsequent operations. But no lesson erased the fundamental reality that on certain ridges, in certain seconds, survival depended on whoever was closest to the ground and willing to act. Generals draft plans, conventions outline principles, engineers design weapons within specifications, yet battle compresses all of that into moments measured in heartbeats. On Peleliu, the coral ridges absorbed artillery, deflected bullets, and sheltered defenders who fought almost to the last man. Against such resistance, Marines adapted relentlessly. Some adaptations were formalized into doctrine. Others lived only in memory, stories of flame against stone, of steel halted by heat, of a battlefield where the margin between sanctioned weapon and improvised solution narrowed to the width of a bunker slit. In the end, the legacy of Peleliu is not a single weapon or tactic. It is a testament to the extremity of conditions under which ordinary men were forced to solve extraordinary problems. And in that crucible, the difference between defeat and survival could hinge on a decision made in fire and dust long before history had time to judge it.